On the 31st of July, 1957, a man named Fred Bright landed a white crappie in the water below Enid Dam in Mississippi. 5 pounds, 3 ounces, 21 inches long, with a 19-inch girth. 68 years have gone by. Nobody has beaten it. There is not even a photograph of the fish that anyone can find. Now look at that date again. The last day of July, sliding straight into August. The dog days. The exact stretch of the calendar when every man standing at the boat ramp will tell you the crappie have quit for the summer. And notice where he was standing. Not out in the middle of the reservoir, below the dam, in moving water, in the one place on that whole river system where food was being carried to the fish instead of the fish having to go out and hunt for it. That is the month of August in a single sentence, and almost nobody reads it that way. I have spent a lot of hours at boat ramps with a clipboard, counting fish and asking people what they caught. Every state resource agency runs creel surveys, and somebody has to stand in that heat and write down what actually comes off the water. You learn the difference between what gets caught in August and what people say gets caught, and you learn that most anglers cannot tell you which of the two crappie species is lying in their cooler. We are going to fix all of that today. 10 baits for August. But you are going to understand why each one works before I hand it to you, because the bait is the last decision you make, not the first. Let me clear something out of the way. There is a version of this conversation you have heard 100 times. The lake settles into layers in the summer. A hard line forms where the warm water on top meets the cold water underneath. Below that line, the oxygen runs thin, and the fish cannot stay there. All of that is true. I covered the oxygen side of it in detail on this channel already, so I am not going to spend your afternoon walking it again. But knowing the thermocline exists is like knowing the restaurant is on the 3rd floor. It gets you into the building. It does not get you a table. In August, 3 other things are running the show, and the tackle industry has no reason on earth to teach you any of them. Where these fish actually are, which is not always the brush pile you are parked on, what they are actually eating, which changes on a clock, and which fish you are standing over, because there is a very good chance you are targeting 2 different species and calling them the same name. Get those 3 right, and the 10 baits at the end of this video stop being a shopping list and start being a system. Start with the one that costs you nothing and changes everything. Geometry. A crappie has the largest eye relative to its body of any freshwater fish in North America. That is not a small detail. Eyes are expensive to build and expensive to carry. Nature does not hand out equipment that big unless the animal is living or dying by it. And here is the part that matters more than the size. Those eyes sit high on the head, angled up and forward, not out to the sides, not down, up. A crappie is built to look at the water above its own back and read the shapes moving across the light up there. So a crappie feeds up. It hunts what is in front of its nose and above it. It will rise 5 feet to take something. It will almost never turn and drop down to chase something below it. Read that again and then think about what you were told to do in July. Drop it straight down. Put it right in their face. Hold it dead still at the depth of the fish. That advice puts your bait level with a crappie's eye at best, and under its chin at worst. Under its chin is a blind spot. That is not a slow bite. That is a bait the fish is structurally not looking at. The correction takes about 4 seconds and costs nothing. Whatever depth you have marked those fish at, put your bait 12 to 24 inches above it. If the school is holding at 18 feet, you are fishing 16.5. If they are at 12, you are at 10.5. Now your bait is sitting in a silhouette against the brighter water overhead, in the exact cone that eye was built to scan. And every fish in that school can see it, not just the ones on top. I want you to notice something about that tip. There is no product attached to it. You cannot patent 18 inches. You cannot pour it into a bottle and reprice it every spring with a new label on the front. There is no place for it on a pegboard at the end of an aisle. Which is precisely why you have been fishing your whole life without anyone mentioning it to you. While we are here, throw out the countdown. Counting 1 foot per second is a rule built around a 1/16 ounce head. Hang a 1/64 under it, and you are drifting, not falling. You count to 20, you think you are at 20 feet, and you are at 9. Count up instead. Let the jig hit bottom, Then reel a measured number of handle turns off it. A turn is a fixed amount of line, and it never lies to you. 3 turns off the bottom is 3 turns off the bottom in any wind, on any line, at any temperature. That is a depth gauge that never needs batteries. Now the second thing, and this is the one I have never heard explained on a fishing channel. Ask 100 anglers what a crappie eats in August, and 98 will say minnows, shad, small fish. And they are partly right. But it leaves out the animal that is actually organizing the crappie's entire day. There is a creature in your lake called the phantom midge. The larvae are almost perfectly transparent. You can hold one up and read a newspaper through it. And they exist in numbers that are difficult to believe, in lakes and reservoirs all over this country. Here is what phantom midge larvae do. During daylight they sit down deep, in the dark cold water near the bottom, where the fish that want to eat them cannot see them, and mostly cannot go. Then, as the light drains out of the sky, they rise. The whole population lifts up off the bottom and climbs into the warmer, brighter water near the top. They feed up there through the night, and at the first gray light of morning, they sink back down and disappear. The zooplankton do the same thing. Up at dark, down at dawn. Millions of small things riding an elevator on a schedule, every single night, in the lake you fish. Now, do the crappie know about this? Researchers working on Hoover Reservoir in Ohio put that question under a microscope. They sampled the water column by day and again at night with scientific sonar, midwater trawls, and zooplankton pumps, tracking crappie, phantom midge, and the plankton they share as prey, all at once, through the hot part of the year. What comes out of work like that is not a lake full of lazy fish. It is a lake that reorganizes itself vertically every evening, and a predator carrying the biggest eyes in fresh water to sit underneath and watch it happen. Steve Quinn wrote about this for In Fisherman years ago in their panfish work, and he put it plainly. Crappie take advantage of the vertical migration of plankton, which climbs toward the surface after dark and falls back at first light. So the depth of your fish in August is not a number, it is a schedule. This is why the man who tells you the crappie are at 22 feet is right and also wrong by the time you get there. He marked them at 2 in the afternoon. By 9 at night the column has lifted, the food is up, the fish are up with it, and he is still dropping to 22 feet and telling everybody the bite died. Set your watch instead. About 45 minutes before dark, start fishing shallower every 10 minutes. Not a lot, 2 feet at a time. You are riding the elevator up with them. On most lakes you will find that the fish you could barely get to bite at 20 feet in the afternoon are eating well at 10 or 12 feet after dark, and they are looking up the entire way. It also explains the submersible light better than the way you usually hear it. The story you get is that the light draws baitfish and the baitfish draw crappie. That is the back half of the chain. The front half is that the light concentrates plankton and phantom midge that were already rising on their own, in a spot you chose. You are not building a food chain, you are putting a bend in one that runs every night without you. Which is why the people who drop a light and pull it back after 15 minutes never catch anything. Give it 30 to 60 minutes, the order never changes, and you cannot rush it. And it is why small wins in August. If a large part of what these fish are keying on is the size of a grain of rice, a 3-inch swimbait is not matching anything. It is a novelty item. Now the third thing, and this is the one I got paid to notice. Standing at that ramp with a clipboard, you ask people what they caught, and most of the time they say crappie. Some of them say white perch or specks or slabs. Very few of them can tell you whether they caught black crappie or white crappie. And in August, those are 2 genuinely different animals with 2 different sets of behavior, living in the same lake and being fished for with the same box. Telling them apart takes 2 seconds. Count the stiff spines at the front of the dorsal fin. 5 or 6, you have a white crappie, and its markings run in faint vertical bars down the sides. 7 or 8, you have a black crappie, and the markings are scattered speckles with no bar pattern. That is it. That is the whole test. Here is why it matters in August. Biologists with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources put transmitters in crappie in Kentucky Lake and followed them. What the telemetry showed is that white crappie clear out of the spawning areas quickly after the spawn and head for deeper water, and black crappie do not do that. Same lake, same season, two completely different travel plans. A separate telemetry study out of Illinois, running 2 years, found black crappie sitting more often in shallower spots, with steeper drop, sandy bottom, and woody cover, while white crappie held in deeper water over flatter ground. Water clarity splits them too. White crappie handles stained and muddy water perfectly well. Black crappie need to see, and they lose ground fast when the water dirties up. And then there is a finding out of Nebraska that ought to be on the wall of every tackle shop in the country. In turbid water, adult black crappie over about 8 inches are poor at catching fish prey, and it puts them into what the researchers described as an energy trap during summer. They burn more than they take in. That study estimated very heavy mortality in those bigger black crappie during July and August, in water in the high 70s to low 80s. Sit with that for a second. In a stained lake in August, the biggest black crappie are not ignoring your minnow imitation because they are picky. They are failing to catch real minnows too. So if your water is stained and you are grinding a shad pattern through a deep brush pile, understand who you are actually fishing for. You are fishing for white crappie, and you should present accordingly. If your water is clear with wood and weed, your blacks are shallower than you think, and they are eating a lot more insects and crustaceans than the guy on the internet told you. Nobody sells that. There is no lure company on this planet with a reason to teach you a 2-second field test that would cut your lure buying in half. Your state agency published it for free, and it has been sitting there the whole time. All right, 10 baits. And I am not ranking these by how much I like them. I am grouping them by what the fish is actually eating, because that is the only ranking that survives contact with the water. The first 3 are plankton tier, rice grain sized. This is the tier almost nobody fishes in August, and it is the tier the fish are living on. Number 1 is a hand-tied marabou jig on a 1/32 ounce head. Marabou is the soft fluff off a turkey feather, and in water it never stops moving. You can hold that rod perfectly still, and the fibers keep breathing on their own with the smallest current in the lake. That is exactly what you need for a fish that will not chase, but will absolutely eat something drifting overhead. You can buy them for a couple of dollars. You can tie them yourself for pennies, and 40 years ago half the crappie fishermen in the South did. Nobody can build a seasonal marketing calendar around a turkey feather and a hook, which is the entire reason you see so little of them now. Number 2 is a micro-soft plastic with lots of fine legs and tentacles, not a smooth paddle tail. You want the ones that look slightly ridiculous, with a dozen thin appendages coming off the body. Those appendages are doing an impression of the larger plankton and the midge larvae, and in clear water in August, that impression is worth more than any color on the card. Fish it on a 1/32 or a 1/64, dead slow, above the school. Number 3 is freshwater grass shrimp. Florida's Fish and Wildlife Agency lists grass shrimp right beside minnows as a standard crappie bait. It is not a secret down there, it is regional. They live in the shoreline vegetation in enormous numbers. You can gather them with a small dip net in minutes for free. They are the right size class for August, and no tackle company will ever ship them to you. Before you gather anything living, check your state and local regulations. Bait collection rules and where you may use what you collect vary enormously by state. And never move live bait, live fish, or water between bodies of water. That is how a lake gets ruined permanently. The next 2 are insect tier, and this is where the black crappie in your clear water live. Number 4 is a live cricket, or a small grasshopper on a light wire hook, fished shallow over deep water. I know how that sounds in a video about summer crappie. Do it anyway on a clear lake in the last hour of light. Black crappie eat far more insects than white crappie do, and they will come up and take something off or just under the surface film in the evening, because everything about that fish is built to look up at exactly that. A cricket costs you almost nothing. Some of the best August evenings I have watched come off a boat ramp involved a $5 tub of them. Number 5 is an ice fishing jig tipped with a wax worm. Yes, in August. Walk into the ice section nobody visits in the summer and buy the smallest tungsten jigs on the peg. Heavy for their size, so they cut down through wind without forcing you up to a bigger profile, and they hang a tiny bait on a horizontal hook. You will not find that combination in the summer aisle because the summer aisle is built on the idea that hot weather means bigger and louder. That is a store layout decision. It is not a biological one. The next three are fry and shad tier. This is where most people start, so I am going to fix how you fish them, rather than tell you something you already own is useless. Number 6 is the smallest live minnow the shop will sell you. Fished on a slip float, hung above the school. Everything about that sentence except the last 4 words is standard advice. The last 4 words are the whole game. Set your bobber stop so the minnow rides a foot to 2 feet over the fish you marked, not level with them. A slip float is the cheapest depth control device ever invented, and most people use it to put the bait in the blind spot. Number 7 is a 2-inch swim bait, long-lined behind the boat. Let out 60 to 100 feet of line, put the trolling motor on a crawl and pull it. No electronics required. This is how you find the fish that are suspended out over open water with nothing under them, and there are a lot more of those in August than the brush pile crowd wants to admit. New York's Environmental Conservation Department says it flatly. As summer runs on, crappie often seem to vanish from a lake, and one big reason is that they suspend over open water, sitting 10 feet down over 30 feet of nothing. Read that again next time somebody tells you to just find the right brush pile. Number 8 is a small underspin, and this is your stained water tool. A little blade under a jig head throws flash and puts out a pulse the fish can track when visibility is poor. Now connect it to what we talked about. Stained water in August means you are fishing white crappie whether you meant to or not, so fish it like you are hunting whites. Deeper, flatter ground, out away from the shoreline cover, and a touch faster than you would in clear water. The last 2 are geometry and reaction. Both are baits you have heard of, and both are almost universally fished wrong. Number 9 is a small jigging spoon, and I want to change one thing about how you use it. The standard instruction is to drop it over the brush and let it flutter down. Think about where that flutter ends. It ends below the fish, in the blind zone, and then you drag it back up through them. You are showing them the least visible part of the whole presentation. Flip it. Get the spoon under the school first on a fast, controlled drop. Then lift sharply through them and let it fall only a short distance, so the flutter finishes above their heads and stays there. Lift and leave. Every fall happens inside the strike cone instead of past it. Same spoon, same brush pile, and it costs you nothing but a change of habit. Number 10 is a tube skipped under a dock, and again, one change. You have been told to shoot for the deepest, darkest corner. That is not where the fish sits. A crappie under a dock in August holds inside the shade and looks out into the light, because a fish in the dark looking at a lit background can see everything and be seen by nothing. It is the same reason you can see into a lit room from a dark yard. So do not aim at the darkest corner. Aim at the shadow line, the edge where the dark water meets the bright water, and let the tube glide across it. Then follow that line as the sun moves, because the ambush edge rotates around the dock all day long. That is a free map, redrawn hourly, that nobody is charging you for. 2 things about August specifically, because August and July are not the same month. The shad that hatched this spring have grown. In early summer, those fry are tiny, and everything wants a small profile. By late August, the survivors are noticeably bigger, so on lakes where crappie are locked onto shad, you may need to step up a size from what worked in June. Carry both. Let the fish tell you which year class they are on. And watch for the first real cold front of the month. The first night that actually feels cool, the surface gives up heat, the top of the column starts to mix, and the bite can turn on harder than anything you saw all summer. Most people have put the crappie rods away by then. That is the day to be out there. One more, and this one is about being a decent steward. Warm water holds very little dissolved oxygen, and a crappie brought up from deep water in August is under real stress. If you are releasing, do it fast and do it wet. If you are keeping, get them properly on ice. Know your limits and your seasons, because they change state to state and sometimes lake to lake. Check your state and local regulations before you go. Last thing, and it costs people more fish in August than anything else. They are called papermouths for a reason. The membrane at the corner of that mouth tears under load. You are fishing light line and small hooks over deep water, so set the drag light Sweep the rod instead of snapping it, and keep it loaded the whole way up. Never lift a big one out of the water by the line. Most slabs lost in August were hooked perfectly well and simply torn off. So here is where I land, and I know some of you are going to disagree with me. I would put live minnows out of my top 3 for August. Not because they do not catch fish, because in this specific month, in most lakes, the fish are keyed on something a lot smaller than the minnow you are buying, and because most people hang that minnow a foot too low to be seen at all. A 1/32 ounce marabou jig, held 18 inches over a marked school at dusk, will outfish a badly positioned minnow all month long. Tell me I am wrong. I want to hear it, and I want the details. And do me one favor. On your next trip out, before you throw anything back or drop it in the cooler, count the spines on that dorsal fin. Then come down here and tell me what you found, what the water clarity was like, and how deep you caught them. Black or white, clear or stained. If a few hundred of us do that, we will have built something on this channel that no tackle catalog has ever bothered to put together. The full write-up goes further than I had room for here. A side-by-side identification chart you can print and keep in the boat, an hour-by-hour schedule for riding the evening rise, the marabou jig recipe, a 30-day log sheet, and the complete source list so you can check every claim I made today yourself. Link is in the description. Fred Bright's fish has been standing for 68 years, caught on the last hot day of July, below a dam, where the food was moving. The lake never shut down. It just stopped explaining itself to anybody who was not paying attention. I will see you out there.